Today we're going to look at tactical nukes. Would the Russians use them, and would they deliver victory? From the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, Putin has shown a willingness to nuclear saber rattle. The potential threat of nuclear escalation has had a profound effect on the shape of Western support. While most analysts are dismissive of the probability that Putin would be willing to pull the world into an all-out nuclear exchange, there is more concern that Russia's nuclear doctrine falls short of ruling out a limited exchange of what are commonly called tactical nuclear weapons. So what are tactical nukes? Nuclear weapons are often divided into two main categories: strategic and tactical. Non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons refer to nuclear weapons designed to be used on a battlefield in military situations. This is opposed to strategic nuclear weapons, which are designed to be used against enemy cities, factories, and other larger area targets to damage the enemy's ability to wage war. You'll notice something about this definition, and that it says nothing about yield. Yield is the strength of a nuclear warhead's detonation. This is typically referred to by a number of kilotons or megatons. That is how many thousands of tons of TNT equivalent that a blast is. 1 kiloton would be 1,000 tons of TNT.
For perspective, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. By modern nuclear standards, this is relatively modest. Both Russia and the US have tested nuclear weapons that were measured in megatons. The Tsar bomb that was detonated by the USSR was 50 megatons. That's 3,000 times as powerful as Hiroshima.
Generally, when we discuss weapons that would be reserved for the battlefield, we tend to consider low-yield versions. That is anything from 1 kiloton to 50 kilotons. Even within this limited range, that is some big variation. There are several reasons why small weapons would be preferred for use on the battlefield. On the battlefield, you want to control the effects of your munitions. Basically, you want to be able to destroy the enemy units without impacting the friendly forces. Whereas a strategic strike may be carried out on territory far away that you have no ambition of occupying, a tactical strike is designed to aid your conventional military units that may need to capture terrain beyond the target. That may require traversing terrain that is contaminated with radiation. Smaller weapons will generally produce less fallout. Smaller munitions can be fired from a wider variety of weapon systems, including field artillery and short-range ballistic or cruise missiles. It is generally assumed that lower-yield nukes that are not aimed at civilian targets would be less likely to trigger an escalation that would involve a strategic level of exchange between nuclear powers. And this is based on the concept of proportional response. Just a little bit of relevant history. Over the last few decades, the US has been whittling down its stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, the US and Europe, concerned that they would be battling huge formations of Russian armor, considered tactical nuclear weapons as a potential backstop for an invasion that would otherwise overwhelm NATO forces. The 80s and 90s brought a number of changes that began to alter that calculus. Smart munitions being deployed meant that NATO could effectively kill enemy forces with fewer munitions. That meant a smaller Allied force could potentially hold off a bigger one if each round was finding its target. The US and others were designing larger and more devastating conventional munitions. So whereas a hardened target like a bunker would have been relatively invulnerable to conventional explosives, a nuke used to be the only thing available that was guaranteed to work. So-called bunker-busting munitions and various fuel-air explosive munitions provided conventional alternatives. The massive Ordnance Air Blast GBU-43, nicknamed Mother of All Bombs, is the most powerful non-nuclear weapon in America's arsenal. The bomb was used for the first time in Afghanistan in 2017. While the US was getting rid of most of our tactical nukes, Russia was keeping a lot of theirs. While Russia has built their own smart munitions, they never had the capability to produce these kinds of weapons on the scale that the West has. Understanding that, they knew that any sustained warfare would ultimately involve the brute force of either a huge number of unguided munitions or potentially the use of nuclear weapons to destroy enemy forces en masse. You don't have to worry about accuracy as much when you have a blast that covers hundreds or thousands of meters. There is perhaps another reason that tactical nukes have lost some favor in Western circles. As technology on weapon systems have evolved, ground units don't require as dense of formations. From World War II era to today, for instance, main battle tanks have adopted better optics, bigger cannons, computerized targeting. This allows a single tank to place accurate fire over a larger sector. Ultimately, this manifests the ability to disperse forces across more terrain without losing fire coverage. This dispersion means that there are fewer ground units per square kilometer. In an analysis on the use of tactical nukes by Pakistan to hold off a hypothetical invasion by India, we see some interesting calculations.
Using Cold War doctrine, it was expected that a heavy division would defend a standard 25-kilometer wide front. But while on the attack, the operational front for an armored division was roughly 8 to 10 kilometers. This produces a density of 80 armored vehicles per square kilometer. But by increasing the spacing to 200 meters, this reduces the density to below 30 per square kilometer. A density of 3 vehicles per kilometer squared is achieved by spacing them about 540 meters apart. This kind of density has been reported for the US and Soviet divisions in Europe. In actual nuclear weapon tests involving military equipment, a 10 kiloton explosion at a range of 370 meters produced an overpressure of 33.35 psi. That was only enough to inflict moderate damage to external fittings, such as track guards. But the tank was able to be driven off, and its gun fired after sand and debris had been removed from the barrel. Extrapolating from this data, it is assumed that a 15 kiloton burst at a height of 400 meters would generate enough overpressure to disable any tanks within 420 meters. But this is only about half a kilometer. For a tank spacing of 100 meters, one 15 kiloton weapon could destroy about 55 tanks. To destroy this many tanks, if they were spaced 300 meters apart, would take 8 weapons of 15 kiloton yield each. To destroy, by blast alone, roughly half a force of 1,000 tanks that were supposed to be well dispersed would require on the order of 100 nuclear weapons of 15 kiloton yield.
Blast is only one of the fatality-creating effects of a nuclear explosion. Heat and radiation also play a role, but both heat and radiation are more of an issue for infantry out in the open than armored vehicles. Both of these would be highly detrimental for infantry within 1 kilometer of the blast, and there could be radiation exposure that could induce illness across a wider area, depending on a number of factors. But the bottom line is that the vast majority of damage to forces in the vicinity of a 15 kiloton nuke is going to be within a 1 kilometer distance. In this paper, they estimated that for Pakistan to destroy 1,000 tanks, they would need to deploy 80 weapons. These numbers stress that to obtain substantial battlefield effect, a large amount of tactical nukes would have to be utilized. So here are some caveats. Militaries on the offensive, and especially when attempting to break through lines, will have denser formations. Thus, it would be more practical to strike forces as they prepare for an offensive. Additionally, the strikes could attempt to achieve a psychological effect, both on the attacking forces and among the political establishment of, say, Ukraine and allied Western nations. We could call it a demonstration strike, where the relative damage to Ukrainian forces could be modest, but the threat of nukes is no longer hypothetical and must be considered by Ukrainians and those who are supporting them. The Ukrainians themselves already see the conflict as an existential threat, so it is unlikely that the introduction of a nuclear attack would persuade them to immediately negotiate. The question of how the US and NATO responds to nuclear attack is bigger than just this conflict. We know that other adversarial nations that either have nuclear arsenals or are considering development of them will be watching how we respond to such an escalation. China, Iran, and North Korea would be very interested to see how the US addresses a nuclear attack. If we back down or fail to deliver a proportional response, that will be taken into consideration with their own strategies. All the same, it's not highly probable that the US would respond with nuclear weapons, mostly because the US has substantial conventional options. It seems more probable that the use of nukes would push us to establish a no-fly zone and counterstrikes on airfields and ballistic missile batteries. Additionally, there may be a naval response that could complicate Russia's Black Sea operations.
It remains my conviction that Putin is attempting to use the conventional tools that are available to bring Ukraine to a favorable negotiation point. While he has little compunction about using brutal military tactics, he continues to carefully gauge potential escalation with the West. The use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield is unlikely to benefit his military's outcome without committing to a massive set of strikes that would force NATO's hand and provide him certain defeat. Bearing all this in mind, we can consider nuclear escalation as a lower probability event. Thank you all for watching. These videos take a lot of work and we're just getting started. Please consider supporting us on our Battlefield AO Patreon page.